So without any further ado, I would like to introduce you to Jodi and Wingerden. And Jodi is actually, I'm really happy to announce, is our newest member at Calvin. She is a coordinator for student support and sexuality studies programming, just got hired. Yesterday was your first day, is that right? So you're going to give me a hand to welcome her. But she's many talented, graduating from Calvin Seminary this summer and also serving at our church's anti-racism team. And this past summer, I think, did an amazing session on CRT, which when I saw it, I was like, this has to be part of Fun Third Week. So she is here in that capacity, but please welcome her and get to know her after the session. So without any further ado, help me again to welcome Jodi.
Thanks, Jane. So yeah, I'm Jodi, and critical race theory, right? So all the discussion and the debate in the last few years, and the mere mention of CRT often elicits pretty strong emotions from people in American society in general, but also particularly within the church. So that's something that we're going to explore a little bit today. What exactly is critical race theory? Why does the very mention of it produce debate? Why has it become controversial in the church? What could or should a Christian response look like? So a couple of years ago on our anti-racism team at our church, as critical race theory started coming up more and more in the things I was hearing and reading, we started talking about it in our anti-racism team meetings. And so we decided that a presentation might be helpful at our church, like Jane said. And then at the same time, I was attending Calvin Seminary, and one of the professors encouraged me to do this, to develop the presentation and submit it as an alternate project for one of my classes. So it kind of just all came together at the right time, and as I've gone and as I've learned more, I revised the presentation, and so this is kind of an overview, kind of a summary of what I've learned so far, and it really just scratches the surface. So if you have questions as we go, please feel free to raise your hand and say them as we go, but also at the end, there will be time for questions, and we can do that then. So let's get started. First and very important question, what is critical race theory? So take just a moment, based on what you know right now, how would you answer that question? Do you even know where to start? And then a couple more questions. What is your gut reaction when you hear the term CRT, or critical race theory? Are there any immediate reactions or emotions that rise in you? Maybe it's more neutral. Maybe you're just curious right now. Where have you heard about CRT? Do you have any concerns? If so, what are they? I think that part of the reason for the confusion about what's going on about CRT right now is that we don't really know what it is. So this is the most basic definition of critical race theory. It's an academic framework that originated among legal scholars in the 1970s to help explain how racism permeates American institutions. So we're going to break that down just a bit. First, it's important to note just a couple things. CRT has been around for more than 40 years. It might seem like a really recent development because of all the debate that's going on right now, but it was developed in the 1970s in the academic world of legal studies, so in law schools, which is the other important thing to note. CRT is an advanced academic framework taught at the highest levels of legal education. Scholars at the graduate and doctorate levels use CRT as a framework for examining how racism impacts laws and customs and practices in the United States. One quick side note before we go on. Another reason for some of the confusion is because critical race theory sounds a lot like another term that gets used, critical theory. And so there's two different definitions of critical theory. Critical theory, uppercase, is this specific school of German philosophy that has associations with Marxism. But lowercase, which is how the term is more generally used today, it's a broad philosophy of assessing and critiquing society and culture in order to reveal and challenge power structures. So this theory argues that social problems stem more from social structures than from individuals. And whereas traditional theory is oriented mainly toward understanding and explaining society, critical theory takes it another step and critiques it in order to change it. So because of this, the thing is with this historical association with Marxism, there's this immediate suspicion of anything that sounds similar, especially within the church. So that's why it's important to understand how critical theory is most often used today, and it's that lowercase definition. So what happened is this. During the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, there were civil rights laws that were put into place that made it illegal to discriminate on the basis of race. But over the next number of years, lo and behold, inequality persisted. And so some legal scholars started asking, if all these laws were passed, then why haven't things gotten exponentially better? If the only thing that was needed was to place all people on this level playing field on paper, then why haven't there been more significant improvements in the lives of African Americans and other people of color in the United States? So by asking these questions, those who study law were able to identify the ways that all the previous laws that came before had a lasting effect on the way American society and institutions were created in the first place. You can't just erase the effects of racism by changing the laws. You can't even erase the effects of racism by making sure that people's hearts and attitudes aren't racist. It'd be nice if it were that easy, but it's not. You have to really examine how those laws impacted the way that this country was formed to begin with. There are large pieces of our society that were set up while these laws were in place, at times when slavery and discrimination were legal, things like schools and home ownership and employment and healthcare. So if the foundation of the pieces is slavery and discrimination, then it makes sense that we're still going to find inequality in those pieces. So, for example, one thing scholars might observe is the problem of lead poisoning in Michigan. The Flint water crisis made national headlines a few years ago, but what a lot of people don't know is that certain zip codes in Grand Rapids, like the zip code that my church is in, 49507, have even higher rates of lead poisoning due to the lead paint that remains in older homes. So scholars who are using the framework of CRT would note that the zip codes with the highest levels of lead poisoning, almost exclusively in cities like Grand Rapids, Detroit, Kalamazoo, Muskegon, Battle Creek, they're also zip codes with high percentages of non-white residents. And so the next question might be, why does this problem persist in these neighborhoods rather than, say, in East Grand Rapids or Grosse Pointe Park, where there are also lots of older homes? And then, why do these neighborhoods have higher percentages of minority residents in the first place? And then, maybe, what percentage of the homes affected are rental properties? So questions like that help scholars to dig into the reasons that the inequality continues to persist. So, CRT, a framework to explain why racial inequality remains a chronic problem in American society. It's a process of historical investigation and explanation, and if it sounds complex, that's because it is. It's an analysis that happens at the graduate level of study. So contrary to what we might be hearing, it is not something that's being taught in elementary or middle or high schools. So because critical race theory produced such profound insights in the field of law studies, it began to be applied in other areas of academic study. CRT has helped in understanding a wide array of disparities in things like educational opportunities, healthcare outcomes, home ownership, income, incarceration, and much more. For example, in looking at home ownership, you might start with the observation that 72% of white families own their own home, while only 43% of black families own theirs. For Asian American families, it's 62%, and Hispanic families, it's 51%. To look at those numbers and assume that race has nothing to do with the differences requires a denial of something obvious enough that it's worth exploring. So the framework of CRT helps in that analysis. Or for another example, scholars who utilize critical race theory in analyzing the prison system might notice how the number of prisoners skyrocketed following the 3 strikes laws that were put in place by the Clinton administration in 1994. They might investigate how the compulsory sentencing laws removed judges' discretion in determining jail time for certain offenses, and how this led to disproportionate numbers of young Black men being arrested and given mandatory life sentences. So, the more widely that CRT was utilized, the more it came to be known. And the more it came to be known, the more broadly critical race theory was defined. It was no longer understood as just a theory of legal academic study. The term trickled into broader society. And as it did this, it kind of interacted with, if we want to bring it down to the most basic, just 2 basic perspectives. And it seems like in the way that this has evolved, perhaps it starts with a question of what does it mean to call yourself an American? The first perspective might say that they are proud of America and everything it stands for. They might talk about their family and how they came to America because it was the land of opportunity. They might talk about working hard to make the American dream happen. They might talk about discrimination being made illegal, and so it's a thing of the past. You may see inequality, but it's not because the country is broken. And so if you blame the systems for being broken, it's like saying the entire country is bad, and you are trying to turn people against their own country. You are unpatriotic. The other perspective might say that the ideals of America don't reflect the reality of many people. They might talk about the ways that certain people weren't included in the dreams of the founders of this country. They might talk about the ways that discrimination has had a ripple effect in their family for generations, or that equality exists at a level that can't simply be explained by people not trying hard enough. They want America to be everything it can be and everything that it could be. And the way to do that is to examine the inequality in order to really understand what's causing it. And so when you see people starting to answer this question these 2 different ways, you realize that what people are doing is they're telling their story. And stories are really important because stories give us our identity. And so if someone is challenging your story, it's an attack on your identity. It feels like a personal attack. So, for example, if you're someone who says, I love America, and the response is, well, actually, there are parts of America that aren't so wonderful, then maybe the implication is that you're not so wonderful for loving it. Or if you say that you feel like the systems are stacked against you, and someone says, well, anyone really needs to just work hard, then maybe the implication is that what you've experienced isn't real, or that it's your fault for not trying hard enough. And so then you get to a point where these stories are competing with each other, and rather than being a both and, they're an either or, because we've lost this ability to consider that there might be truth in both stories at the same time. So it makes sense then that a lot of this debate focuses on how we tell our story, the story of America. A lot of the debate is focused on the teaching of American history and how we go about that, the way that the story of America is told. In teaching the history of the United States, the debates have focused on the balance between patriotism and American exceptionalism on one hand, and the country's history of enslavement and exclusion and violence on the other hand. Do we teach this country's ideals, or do we teach this country's practices? For the most part, the teaching of American history has focused on the ideals and emphasized the principles of freedom and democracy for everyone. But as the study of history grew to include a more nuanced perspective, many felt that the importance of telling a narrative that was more truthful was the way to make this country what it could be. And there was an effort to have a narrative that balanced both the ideals and the practices, a narrative that told both stories. So in the 1990s, there was an effort to set national history standards that provided this balance. But what happened was that these standards were rolled out during the 1994 election cycle, and they became politicized. Because what happened was politicians began to vigorously oppose them when they realized that there were certain constituents with whom they gained a lot of traction. And it just so happened that the Republican Party found itself in the home stretch of an election where they would gain control of Congress for the first time in 40 years. So it was really important to them to get constituents. And so they found that attacking the standards provided a lot of traction with the people who were complaining about excessive political correctness or multiculturalism, and who felt that their picture of America was being tarnished. So you get people saying things like, "We are a better people than the national standards indicate, and our children deserve to know it." Or calling the standards a bastardization of American history, saying that the United States doesn't deserve the reputation it's getting in multicultural classrooms. And then there was one critic who called the new standards nothing more than a cynical ploy to indoctrinate children with their own hatred of America, to steal the American birthright from children of our country, to teach our children to feel guilt over their own heritage. And then continued, "Are we prepared to allow the haters of America to dictate how American history will be taught to our children?" So there you see, we've got the two perspectives. History that dwells on unsavory or even horrific episodes in our past is unpatriotic and likely to alienate young students from their own country. Or exposing students to grim chapters of our past is essential to the creation of informed, responsible citizens. And because political campaigns in this country are a battle, it's a fight to see who's going to win or who's going to lose, these stories, these issues become the weapons. And then there's no longer the possibility to consider that both of those stories might hold some truth, and there's no nuance anymore. We have to choose sides because the stories cannot coexist. So 25 years later, we have the same debates, but the particular thing under attack has a new name, and the similarities in the arguments are pretty difficult to ignore. In 1994, Newt Gingrich said, "From the Jamestown colony and the Pilgrims, through Tocqueville's Democracy in America, up to the Norman Rockwell paintings of the 1940s and 50s, there was a clear sense of what it meant to be an American. Our civilization is based on a spiritual and moral dimension. It emphasizes personal responsibility as much as individual rights. Since 1965, however, there's been a calculated effort by cultural elites to discredit this civilization." And then in 2020, Donald Trump, who sounds very similar, calling critical race theory, the 1619 Project, and the crusade against American history toxic propaganda, an ideological poison that, if not removed, will dissolve the civic bonds that tie us together. Those comments from Donald Trump came in 2020 after the term CRT saw a surge in popularity, particularly on Fox News. Until 2020, critical race theory had only been mentioned a few times ever on that network. But in 2021, between April and July alone, the term was mentioned more than 2,000 times. So the surge in interest is most often attributed to a guy named Christopher Rufo. He's a political activist, and he started tweeting about CRT in the months leading up to the 2020 election. And at this point, his name is virtually synonymous with opposition to critical race theory. In early September of 2020, he was invited on Tucker Carlson's show on Fox News. And during that show, Rufo warned viewers that CRT had pervaded every institution of the federal government and was being weaponized against Americans. And he called on President Trump to ban such training in all departments. Within 3 weeks, Trump had signed an executive order banning the use of critical race theory by all federal departments and contractors in diversity training. And this tweet on the screen from Rufo in March 2021 demonstrates this concerted effort to undermine critical race theory and anything associated with it. He wrote, "We have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all of the various cultural insanities under that brand category. The goal," he says, "is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans." So this is a pretty intentional effort to discredit anything that sounds like critical race theory. And so in the broader American conversation, critical race theory steadily became used as a weapon, and in the process became this catch-all phrase for anything left-leaning that the conservative right opposed. And the strategy was really effective. The most prominent way it's played out has been in the field of education. This map from a few months ago shows the number of states in which legislation was proposed to ban public schools from teaching anything that resembles critical race theory. Many of the bills use language from President Trump's ban. For example, the proposed bill in Arkansas was called the Save American History Act, and it prohibited using federal funds to teach these ideas in schools, saying it threatens the integrity of the Union by denying the true principles on which it was founded. And all of the proposed or adopted legislation has varying degrees of restriction, but all of it aims to regulate how teachers can talk about racism and sexism and other issues of equality and justice in the classroom. So this is where we find ourselves. We are in this place and this moment of time where our stories have become weapons in a political machine. And it's become so commonplace that we get sucked into it. And we just adopt it, and we assume that we know what people are talking about because the side that we've chosen has told us that this is something we should be either really for or really against, but we don't necessarily know exactly what it means. So it all explains a lot, but we still haven't talked about where the church comes into all this. Except that if you know the history of the United States, you know that Christianity, in a lot of ways, has shaped this country's story. We can look at pretty much any moment in this country's history and see how the church has been right in the middle of a lot of the debates. And so when we look at critical race theory, specifically in relation to Christianity, we can see that church leaders were actually taking issue with it at least a couple of years before it started popping up in the broader public. In 2018, critical race theory was already a hot topic in the church, particularly the evangelical church and the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest Christian Protestant denomination in the United States. It was then that a group of evangelical leaders drafted a statement on social justice and the gospel, also known as the Dallas Statement, in which they asserted that critical race theory, intersectionality, radical feminism, and other so-called postmodern ideologies were contrary to Scripture. And then in 2019, the Southern Baptist Convention passed a resolution that denounced critical race theory and intersectionality. But it wasn't strong enough for some people. And so as critiques of the ideologies continued, the Conservative Baptist Network was formed. According to their purpose statement, they reject we reject early ideologies infiltrating the Southern Baptist Convention, including critical race theory, intersectionality, and other unbiblical agendas deceptively labeled as social justice. In 2020, the Council of Seminary Presidents of the Southern Baptist Convention, which includes 6 different seminaries, issued a statement saying that affirmation of critical race theory, intersectionality, and any version of critical theory is incompatible with the Baptist faith and message. And in 2021, a large segment of the Southern Baptist Convention campaigned for a new resolution that actually contained even stronger language. So it's here, when we look at the statements coming out of the church, that we see how it might be that critical race theory started to become a shorthand term that lumps all of these things together. And the list of those things keeps getting longer. For example, more recently, the term wokeism has become a way of criticizing the idea of being woke to injustice. And this is one of the biggest ironies, right? That the word justice, which is a huge theme in the Bible, has become a huge red flag for people in the church. So, since a lot of criticism about critical race theory has come from the church, I think it's important to try to understand the concerns that people are raising so that we can better evaluate the criticisms. I do think a lot of the criticism does come from people not really understanding what it is, but I think it's also important to understand the criticisms that linger so that we can evaluate their merits. And then since Christians who are opposed to critical race theory have a lot of the same concerns as the general public, I'm going to start with the concerns that are most often cited by those who are having this conversation about that field of education and the reasons for opposing the teaching of it in schools. So the first of those concerns is this idea of disillusionment, that teaching about racism will teach students an overly pessimistic view of our systems that will keep them from engaging in society. So in other words, they might end up saying, well, if this is the way the society is, and if this is the way the systems and structures are built, then why would I even bother trying to work to change them anyway? It's kind of useless. The next concern is the idea of indoctrination. Because critical race theory has become associated with the liberal left, there is this concern that teaching anything resembling CRT is equivalent to an attempt to persuade students to adopt this particular political stance and everything it stands for. So in the most extreme criticisms, the accusation is that there is a concerted effort by public schools to brainwash students. But really the underlying concern here is for educators to teach in a way that isn't biased, which is a really high value in the American public school system. Another criticism is that teaching about race actually creates division that wasn't there before. Many of the education bills ban usage of any teaching or methodology or curriculum that promotes or causes a racial divide. Then there's a concern about race essentialism. The idea that dwelling on race and racism leads to reducing people to just one part of their identity. So the criticism here is that teaching about race overemphasizes it to the point of ignoring the other aspects about a person. Which leads to the next concern, that when you reduce people to this one part of who they are, when you dwell on the racism, you produce collective guilt or collective disempowerment. So a major argument against teaching about racism is the idea that white students are being told that simply by virtue of being white, they are guilty of participating in and perpetuating racism. And then on the flip side, people raise concerns that students of color, by virtue of being in the minority, are doomed to be oppressed and will feel disempowered. Finally, when you emphasize collective guilt or group oppression, one of the fears is that discrimination is discrimination against the dominant group, like silencing white voices or using affirmative action, which to some people feels like denying opportunity to white people. So Christians who oppose critical race theory have some additional concerns, or maybe just different ways of articulating the same concerns. The most general criticism of critical race theory from Christians is that it is incompatible with Scripture, and that the role of the church is to just preach the gospel. So let's start with the ways that they might say that it is unbiblical. One of their points is that Scripture tells us that our primary identity is that we are children of God. We are God's image bearers. So an emphasis on any other identity, such as race, de-emphasizes our primary identity and causes division among Christians. And then they say that this division harms the unity of the church. A person's perspective on sin also impacts the critical race theory conversation. Some parts of the church view sin as primarily a condition of the individual heart, And so salvation is primarily about attaining eternity in heaven. But other segments of the church talk more about how sin pervades all of creation, including human systems and institutions, and then emphasize that the church is called to bring Christ's kingdom to bear in the world here and now. So for Christians who emphasize sin as an individual heart condition, teaching something like critical race theory seems to be asking them to accept guilt for something they say they didn't do, or a feeling they don't have in their own heart. Another concern for Christians is that the story of the gospel is a story of good triumphing over evil. And again, this is about the way we tell a story and the way that that story shapes our identity. If our focus is in telling the gospel is how good overcomes evil, we will focus on the good in the story. So telling the less than savory parts becomes equivalent to denying the power of the gospel. And all of these first points, the child of God, the unity, emphasis on individual sin, and the power of the gospel, those all contribute to this idea in Christianity that we are all sinful before God, and we are all saved by God. So the criticism is that we don't need to differentiate the ways that we're broken because no person's guilt is more than another's. And then finally, the suspicion of social justice in the church often comes from criticism of programs that emphasize human effort as the priority of the church. These Christians say that in focusing on social programs, we lose sight of the church's true purpose, which is evangelism, or saving souls. So as we begin to understand a little bit more about what critical race theory actually is, and as we understand a little bit about what's behind some of the concerns, we can begin to evaluate the merits of that criticism. Since the primary criticism is that teaching about racism and other injustice is unbiblical, I think we start by looking at Scripture. What kind of story or stories does the Bible tell? In the story that the Bible tells, do we get the good and the bad? Do we learn about the goodness of creation and the misery of the fall? Do we learn only about the ways that Israel pleased God, or also about the ways that Israel failed? Are the characters one-dimensional? Was David, the man after God's own heart, capable of pretty horrible things? Was Rahab, a prostitute, also honored as an ancestor in Jesus' line? Was the Apostle Paul also at one point the most notorious persecutor of all those who followed Jesus? In the story that the Bible tells, how is God described? If justice is one of God's major attributes, and if Jesus is described as the one who brings justice, then why does a large segment of the church balk at that word? And for the Christians who embrace the idea of justice, how does the Bible show us where our human ideas of justice fall short? And in the story that the Bible tells us, do we get the version of the story that's told by the most powerful kingdoms and nations like Egypt and Rome or Babylon? Or do we get the version of the story that's told by those who are downtrodden, whose voices generally didn't count for much in the eyes of the rest of the world? If the Bible is our guide, then we don't have to be afraid of stories that contain both the good and bad. And if the Bible is our guide, we absolutely cannot discount justice. And if the Bible is our guide, we'd better be paying attention to those who are telling stories about power and oppression. So when it comes to the critical race theory debate, who are the ones whose voices typically haven't counted for much? For a large segment of the church, particularly the white evangelical church, the story of the gospel is about saving souls and bringing people to faith, to a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. But for many Christians, particularly those who are minorities or who live in the third world, the gospel is just as much about how Christ preaches and brings freedom in the world here and now, and then calls the church to be part of that work. I think it's safe to say that the minority race church has felt as though it is under attack in the critical race theory debate. Rather than listening to the story that they are telling, a large segment of the church, they say, has chosen instead to attack a particular term and to attack anyone who says anything that can be put under that term. And not to just attack them, but to accuse them of not preaching the gospel. As the debate about critical race theory has intensified, minority Christians and pastors and theologians have overwhelmingly expressed their extreme disappointment that the church's focus has been on attacking the message rather than doing something about the injustice that is at the heart of that message. For them, CRT simply describes their experience, and they have little patience left for the parts of the church that aren't even trying to listen. So let's take a moment to listen to what they're saying. Starting with something that Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in his book, Where Do We Go From Here, more than 50 years ago. Many of the ugly pages of American history have been obscured or forgotten. A society is always eager to cover misdeeds with a cloak of forgetfulness, but no society can fully repress an ugly past when the ravages persist into the present. When the Southern Baptist Convention made its statement against critical race theory, a number of black pastors publicly left the denomination. Jemar Tisby, a black Reformed theologian and author, recently called those who leave their churches to leave loud. He said to leave loud is to tell our stories, to name things for what they are, to take back the dignity we've lost while being in institutions that don't value the fullness of the image of God within us, and to go where we are celebrated and not just tolerated. He noted that black Christians, when they encounter racist attitudes in their churches, they tend to leave quietly for a variety of reasons. But then he points out that in doing so, it doesn't require churches to wrestle with their reasons for leaving. And he encouraged those who are able to let their churches know about the racism they've experienced. And then he went on to criticize those Southern Baptist seminary presidents. And he said, by highlighting critical race theory, intersectionality, and any version of critical theory as particularly acute threats to Southern Baptist orthodoxy, the seminary presidents take aim at virtually anyone who advocates for racial justice beyond hugs, handshakes, and symbolic statements. For several years, fundamentalist Christians have positioned CRT as an epithet within Christian circles. It is the theological and ecclesiastical equivalent of the Red Scare. Slap anyone with the critical race theory label, and they automatically become enemies of the church. Lisa Sharon Harper, a Christian author and speaker, wrote, "You claim the secular nature of CRT makes it unbiblical. That's a non sequitur. Simply because scholars in secular contexts see something and theorize around it does not mean that what they see is unbiblical. It means that they see it in their context too." To the 6 Southern Baptist seminary presidents who denounced CRT, do you realize that you denouncing CRT is like a bank robber denouncing laws against stealing? Esau McCaulley, an author and professor of New Testament at Wheaton College, wrote, "The body of Christ told us to just preach the gospel. There are very few things more harmful for Christian cooperation than the weaponization of the gospel against black and brown cries for justice. Only in the context of racial injustice are we told to articulate the plan of salvation exclusively. When marriages are struggling, we don't just preach the gospel to couples, we give them practical tools to love one another better. When parents are looking for clues on how to raise children, we do not simply preach the gospel, we give them Bible-informed tools to parent well." And one more from Dante Stewart, a theologian and author. "The whole time people have argued why they're against critical race theory, not one time have they mentioned how they will love black people. I want to live in a world where our black lives and humanity are not reduced to an argument, a theology, or any other thing that is based on white acceptance and comfort." It seems to me that in attacking critical race theory and everything that is now associated with it, the church isn't listening. And here's the thing about stories. They have the power to bring people together rather than split them apart. And Christians should know that better than anyone else. But the only way our stories bring us together is if we truly listen to each other. And true listening isn't just about hearing, it's about empathy. It's about desiring to understand another person. It's about seeing both the beauty and the brokenness in each other's lives. True listening can turn our world upside down in the very best way. And I'm going to end with just a personal story about how that happened to me one time, not quite a year ago. I was at my kid's school, and there was a person who was doing a presentation. He is someone who had been invited to work with the school in doing some self-reflection and evaluation about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And his focus that night was on carrying each other's burdens. And so during his talk, he started to tell us about this video that he had seen on YouTube. It was a backyard pool party. There were lots of kids and lots of adults everywhere. And this toddler falls into the pool, and he's floating on his stomach. And there's all these adults sitting there, a lot of them with their feet even in the pool. And you know how when something happens and you aren't quite sure what's going on and you take a while to process, and they're just kind of watching and waiting. And suddenly from off screen, this guy comes running, fully clothed, and dives into the pool and rescues the kid. And our presenter said he, of course, was this boy's father. And he had acted without hesitation because he loved the little boy. And I was nodding. I was tracking along with where he was going with this story, that we should all be watching out for each other so that we can carry each other's burdens. And then he said something that totally stopped me in my tracks. And he said, I see you, and I love you, and I am willing to jump in that pool with you. In listening to that story, it had not even occurred to me that I might be the one drowning in the pool. It had not occurred to me that I might be the one in the story who needs rescuing. I might not be the one in the story who always is the one to see and observe and rescue. There was this blind spot that I had never quite seen in that way before. I might need rescuing from the distorted way that I see things, so that I can see a story that is bigger and more beautiful than the one I had known before. There are Christians who are stepping out, willing to take a risk of showing us what we are missing. For a very long time, minority Christians have been carrying the church's burden, the burden that we cannot see our own brokenness in the church. But many of these Christian men and women have been patiently trying to help us see the beauty of what we are missing, the richness and the depth that comes with understanding the experiences of the whole body of Christ. Because that's the power of a gospel that includes telling all the stories together. Thank you. I've been told that if you have questions and want to ask them, the microphone would be helpful, because then it gets on the recording. Or if you want to shout it out, I'm happy to repeat them too. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for this. This is really interesting. I was interested in what you were saying about when you're looking at biblical themes and narratives and big ideas in Scripture, how that could potentially complicate our ideas about race and justice. But it seems to me that everything is downstream of politics these days. And, and I don't know how to be convinced otherwise. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, when you say convinced otherwise, like convinced to think differently than how you already do?
No, convinced that there might be a way to, for people to sort of break out of entrenched views, even if the narrative is compelling, if the story is there, if, if you're using something that is, that is a sacred object, like a scripture. It seems like politics is so powerful in shaping our views about things like race that it's hard to see around that.
Yeah, I don't think you're the only one who thinks it's hard to see around that. Being at seminary and being in lots of different churches, all pastors are they're asking this question, how do we even go from here? And I think the way that I see it is just that the church has an opportunity to be different, right? In the world, not of the world. And so how can the church show us how to be able to have conversations with each other and how to listen well to each other? And if the church can maybe start there, I don't know how we go about it, right? But just in our own little networks, maybe it's by listening to someone that you totally disagree with, but really listening. So the Colossian Forum, if anybody's heard of the Colossian Forum, they do these groups that they have a curriculum where they intentionally get people together who have differing opinions about things and put them in a group and get them to talk about it. And our daughter was in high school a couple years ago and was part of one of these groups, and she had been this this is the way it is, and if you disagree with me, you're a horrible person. And I could see that over the course of that group, she would say things like, well, I really am annoyed by so-and-so, but I can really understand now, after listening to him, that he actually has thought through how he came to this conclusion, and I see that he is more thoughtful than I thought. But just even the fact that they had connected and been able to listen to each other was huge, right? And then it changes the climate of the water you're swimming in. So I think we start by listening, and however you can do that wherever you are. Yeah.
I think for both politics and the church, defining what does conversation mean is the key, along the lines you were saying. It seemed to me very generous in many of the things you put up there to talk about it as conversation when some of the examples you had, it's like, well, my opponent hates America. My opponent is teaching white children to feel guilty. Now, what's your view? If you get to define what your opponent hates, and I don't think many people do hate America on the other side there, and if you get to define what the other people are actually saying, I've seen no evidence of anybody teaching white children to feel guilty in grade schools, then you're not starting a conversation. The other side has no place to begin because you have attributed not only motivations but policies to them and said that's what we want to discuss. Yeah. When they actually have motivations, they actually have policies, you have to, if you want to have a conversation, listen first to what they think and who they are. Yeah. And also say for yourself what your view is. In many cases, the laws that are being passed are very vague. They don't say what is good. They say, oh, teaching people to be guilty is bad, but what kind of history should we teach? They're so vague that basically teachers are now fearful that anything they say can be held against them because there's no standard. So conversation, say what you mean and don't tell other people what they mean.
Well, yeah, and part of that, right, is, I mean, we live in it's social media, right? We get so much of our information on media. So for example, I was scrolling through Facebook one day, and there's another parent at the school I know who says, just post something about critical race theory and how awful it is and how Christians have to be opposed to it. And everybody in the feed was chiming in, yes, you're right, this is horrible. And I'm thinking, well, if this is the only place you're getting your information, like, what do you really know about critical race theory except that your friends don't love it? And so if nobody chimes in and nobody talks to each other, so I just jumped in and I said, hey, I actually have learned a little bit about it, and I don't think it's unscriptural. If you'd like to talk about it, let me know. And of course, it never happened. But at least then there's like a person out there challenging it. But can we do it in a way that's generous when we're in person with each other? Because that's part of the problem, is that there's so little of the the interaction happening between, we choose the sides based on what we hear, and then the sides keep doing this, and then there's a lot less of this. So. Hey, Kyle.
Jodi, thanks for this fantastic presentation, both for your work to put it together and for all the folks who put this event together.
Yeah, for sure.
My question is, do you have thoughts on why intersectionality gets wrapped up with critical race theory? I'm particularly interested because it feels like critical race theory is trying to explain all these disparities in society based on race. And intersectionality is saying, actually, there's a much more complex picture with all these things that impact any given choice and situation. And it feels like many of these pastors and thinkers and other folks who are demonizing critical race theory would really like a theory that says your faith commitment has something to say about how you live and these other aspects of your identity do. So
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is buzzword, right? So these buzzwords, if they're words that you've never really heard before, but then someone puts them on, the Southern Baptist Convention statement, and they pick out these words, right? Why did they pick that particular word? Who knows, right? But it comes maybe from a lot of the same, and a lot of it is a suspicion of academia, right? And so in the church, especially the conservative church, there's a lot of suspicion about higher education. And so those words come from those places. And then suddenly there's these buzzwords, right? That the second you say them, you're going to get labeled. So little example, there was a church that I preached at. I preached on the story of the rich man. And I think somewhere in the sermon, I used the idea of power and privilege, that our abundance is supposed to draw us into community. And so what do you have in abundance that you might be able to use to draw community together rather than, isolate yourself? And I think I used the word power, like, do you have a lot of power? Do you have a lot of privilege? And someone I heard later said, well, I hope we're not considering her for our new, they had an open position, because that's critical race theory. Like the word power, the word privilege, suddenly it's like, oh, they must be preaching critical race theory. But I was preaching a parable. So. Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm just curious, do you think when engaging in conversation, we should just not say certain words or just say them and let people deal?
That's a really good question. I suddenly was like, if I'm going to preach that again, maybe I need to revise it so that I don't immediately write. Like, that's part of it. And honestly, with this presentation, I tried for really, really hard to not make it so, feel so anti-Republican. Because you're just going to turn people off right away because they're going to be offended, right? So I think, we do have to think about who are we talking to? And when we're talking one-on-one to people, and if we know that that might be something that's going to right away stop them from listening. So if the importance is listening, being generous in a way that you're not using words that might hurt the listening. Yeah. There are other ways to say things. I worked at the Rhetoric Center way back when. I know this.
Sorry, I just wanted to share that all of these books on the list here, they're all available through Heckman Library.
Nice. Woohoo!
As a matter of fact, I'm creating a reading list right now, which I'll share on our Instagram. So check it out and get reading.
Thank you. And actually, those are listed on the handout, too. So if you want to grab a handout, except for Cole Arthur Riley, I added her just in the last few days because all of a sudden I was like, oh, yeah, that's a great book. So, but all the other ones are on the handout. So I would say thank you so much. If you have questions, you want to talk afterwards, please, walk on up and find me, and thanks for coming. And thank you, Jane, and the office. Oh, my goodness.